There's a particular exhaustion that combat produces, which is different from every other kind. It is not the exhaustion of hard physical labor, though it includes that. It is not the exhaustion of lost sleep, though it includes that too. It is the exhaustion of being required hour after hour and day after day to make the decision to keep going, to choose, in the face of everything screaming at you to stop, to take one more step, fire one more shot, carry one more man, make one more flight. Every step of the chosen breakout was that decision made again. And the men making it were running on empty tanks and sheer refusal, which turns out to be its own kind of fuel. The column reached Koto-ri on December 7th. Another thin perimeter. Another small airstrip scratch from frozen ground. This one capable of handling the smaller aircraft. More OY. One Stinson's, more helicopters from Gottschalk's VMO, 6, carrying out the men who had been wounded on the road between Hagari and here. The math of saving people was continuous, and the men doing it did not pause to contemplate the math. They just kept doing it. But between Koto-ri and the coast, there was one more problem. One more thing that should have been the end. The Chinese had blown a bridge. Not just any bridge. The bridge at Funchalen Pass, a 24-foot gap in the only road south, at the top of a cliff face drop that gave the men looking at it the specific sick feeling of a door that had just been locked from the outside. No bridge meant no vehicles. No vehicles meant leaving behind not just equipment, but the wounded who could not walk. Men who had survived East Hill, survived the airlift, survived the road from Udamanai, who had come this far in broken bodies held together by sheer stubborn breathing, and the hands of the men carrying them, who now sat at the edge of this gap and were looking at the end of the road. The engineers looked at it. They looked at the cliff face below. They looked at the 24-foot gap. They looked at what they had, which was almost nothing, and they thought about what they needed, which was a treadway bridge section, which was a piece of equipment that was nowhere near Funchalen Pass. Except it could be made to be. General Smith sent the request up the chain. The request reached the Air Force. The Air Force loaded 4 sections of treadway bridge into C-119 flying boxcar cargo planes, each section weighing more than 2,000 pounds, and flew them to Funchalen Pass and dropped them by parachute onto the frozen ground near the gap. One section was lost when its parachute failed. Another landed on the wrong side of a ridge. 2 sections landed usably close to the bridge site. 2 sections were enough. The engineers worked through the night to put them in. They worked in the dark and in the cold and under the fire of Chinese troops who understood perfectly well what was happening and wanted very badly to prevent it. They worked with hands that were already damaged by frostbite and tools that kept jamming in the cold, and the knowledge that every man in the column behind them was waiting on what their hands could build. By morning, the bridge was in. The column crossed. Vehicles first, then men on foot, then the last stragglers, and then the engineers themselves who had built it, crossing over the work of their own nearly destroyed hands, looking back exactly once, and then not looking back anymore because there was still road to cover. The last 12 miles to the sea, from Chinhanganai to the port of Hongnam, went almost without incident. The Chinese, beaten back at Hagari by Myers's 80 men on East Hill, hammered for 6 days by air support pilots who flew until their aircraft ran out of things to shoot, ground down by the column that refused to stop, were not in a condition to block the road anymore. The Marines and soldiers who had been written off in a dozen warm offices reached the coast on December 11th and found something there that none of them, in the dark hours on the road from Udamanai, had been entirely certain they would see again. The sea, a fleet of ships, hot food, other men who had not been through it, whose faces showed them what they looked like from the outside, which was terrible by any measure, frost-darkened and hollow-eyed, and moving with the particular deliberate care of people in whom something very deep was being careful not to break. General Smith stood at the dock and watched his men come in. He had been told, when the Chinese first appeared in those numbers, that his division was finished. He had not believed it, not because he was reckless or foolish, but because he knew his Marines in a way that the men delivering that assessment did not. He had slowed his advance against orders because he trusted what his own eyes told him about the ground and the enemy. He had established supply depots that everyone called unnecessary, and that turned out to be the difference between survival and annihilation. He had given his men a day of rest in the middle of a breakout because he understood that will is not infinite and must be tended. He was, by every measure the situation could provide, exactly the right man in exactly the right place. But he was not the story. He knew he was not the story. He said so. The story was the pilots. Not any single pilot. Though individual men did extraordinary individual things in those 6 days and deserve their names said clearly and in full. The story was the fact of them. The fact that when the calculations were run and the conclusion delivered that the men at Hagaruri were beyond saving, men in cockpits looked at that conclusion and flew into it anyway. The 21st Troop Carrier Squadron flew 540 of the most severely wounded men out of Hagaruri in conditions the Air Force officially deemed too dangerous for flight nurses. That number, 540, is the number of men the logistical calculus had left behind when it ran out of good options. Those men were lying in the tents and on the frozen ground listening to the rifle fire getting closer every night, and the pilots of the 21st Troop Carrier Squadron flew in and took them out. Not once, not twice, again and again and again, until all 540 were gone. The total number evacuated in 6 days was 4,369 wounded and dead carried on aircraft that kept flying despite bullet holes and ice and mountains and darkness and every mechanical and atmospheric reason to turn back. The pilots who flew those missions came home to their bases and their debriefs and their reports, and the reports are careful, precise documents that describe wind conditions and runway length and aircraft weight and cargo manifests, because that is what reports are. The reports do not describe what it felt like to bring a C-47 down through the mountain air above a strip that the rule book said could not be used, and feel the landing gear take the ice, and know that in the back of the aircraft there were men for whom this moment was the difference between everything and nothing. Some things are too large for reports. There's an accounting to be done, even now, even after all this time. 1,000 Marines and soldiers were killed in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Thousands more were wounded. The cold took fingers and toes and ears and pieces of faces. The Chinese, who had come to destroy the 1st Marine Division, lost more than 50,000 men killed and wounded, a number so large that the Chinese government did not acknowledge the full cost of the Chosin Reservoir for decades afterward, because some numbers are easier to keep quiet. The men who came home from Chosin came home changed in the specific way that surviving something unsurvivable changes a person. It does not make them noble or heroic in a way that can be performed for others. It makes them quiet about certain things and very clear about others. It makes them intolerant of waste because they have seen what is not wasted, what burns clean and honest, and they know the difference. The men who came home from Chosin were called the Frozen Chosin, and they kept that name the way men keep names that mean something more than the words contain. Major Reginald Myers received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman on October 29, 1951. He stood in the White House and accepted it the way he accepted most things, without particular ceremony, without the performance of humility that is sometimes more about the performer than the deed. He said he didn't think he'd done anything special. He said this with the genuine bewilderment of a man who had spent 14 hours on a frozen hill defending 540 sleeping wounded men from 4,000 Chinese soldiers and truly did not understand why that required medal. The pilots of the 21st Troop Carrier Squadron received the Air Medal. Their commander received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citations describe their performance as outstanding and courageous, which is accurate but not sufficient, the way a weather report is accurate but not sufficient to describe a storm. Gottschalk and his VMO 6 crews flew until the last wounded man was gone, and then kept flying because the column still needed them. The whole war still needed them. Some things do not end cleanly. But here's the thing about this story that matters most, and it is not a battle statistic. Somewhere in those 6 days of December 1950, in the space between the sound of Chinese rifles in the dark and the sound of a C-47 engine on final approach, something was demonstrated about what human beings can do when they decide not to accept the verdict. Not out of naivety. The pilots who flew into Hagaruri knew exactly what the risk was. Not out of orders. Several of those flights were made on personal initiative by men who had not been directed to go and who went anyway. But out of something that does not have a clean name in any language, something that sits at the intersection of duty and stubbornness and love, if love is understood in its broadest sense as the thing that makes one person unable to leave another person behind. That quality, the refusal to walk away, is not rare in the way that people sometimes claim great courage is rare. It exists in ordinary people in ordinary circumstances all the time, as anyone who has ever watched a parent sit up all night with a sick child, or seen a teacher stay after school for the student who needs it, or known someone who simply showed up when showing up was the hard thing, already knows. It is not rare. It only becomes visible when the stakes are high enough that the choice to walk away would be forgivable, understandable, strategically rational, and someone chooses not to. The pilots who came in and out of Hagaruri in December 1950 were making a choice that was forgivable not to make. The weather was real. The enemy fire was real. The inadequacy of the strip was real. Every reason to turn back was present and verifiable and would have appeared in the accident report as mitigating circumstances if the aircraft had gone down. Nobody would have said it was the pilot's fault. The conditions were extraordinary. The risk was unreasonable. The decision to fly would not have been criticized. They flew anyway. They flew in, and they loaded the men that someone else had written off, and they flew back out, and they did not stop until the last of those men was gone. And those men, the ones who lay on the frozen ground of Hagaruri, listening to the Chinese get closer in the dark, grew old. Some of them grew very old. They had grandchildren who asked about the scar on the hand or the ear that was shaped wrong, and the men looked at the question for a moment before answering, the way a person looks at something they have carried for a long time and still haven't entirely decided what to say about. What they said usually was something about the cold, something about Korea in winter, something about the sound an airplane makes when it comes out of the dark. What they did not always say, but what was underneath everything they did say was this: somebody came back for us. When the numbers said it was over and the reasonable thing was to leave us there, somebody came back. That is the whole story. It always was. The hills of North Korea are quiet now. The reservoir is still up there, still frozen in winter, still holding the same cold it held in December 1950 when the last C-47 lifted off the airstrip at Hagaruri and climbed over the ridgeline and carried the last of the written-off men toward the coast and the sea and the long, slow journey home. The pilots who flew that strip are old men now. Most of them. Some are already gone, their names on walls and in archives and in the specific kind of memory that families carry from one generation to the next, imperfect and partial and irreplaceable. What they did does not require inflation. It does not require the language of mythology. It was hard work done by mortal men in impossible conditions for the oldest reason in the history of human beings in extremity. Because those were their people, and you do not leave your people behind. The hydraulic warning light had been on for 4 minutes when Sarah made a decision that her commanding officer would later describe in his official report as tactically unconventional, and in private conversation as the kind of thing that makes you want to ground someone and promote them at the same time. She did not return to base. The regulations allowed for it. The aircraft damage gave her reasonable justification. Any flight review board looking at the situation, damaged tail rotor hydraulics, hostile positions confirmed active, degraded maneuvering capability, would have nodded and signed the paperwork if she had turned around and nursed the Apache back to the forward operating base. Nobody would have questioned it. Nobody would have written a negative word. Instead, she climbed. Not recklessly. Not as a statement. She climbed because the geometry of the situation required it. The 3 positions on the right ridgeline were staggered in depth, which meant that a low-altitude approach gave her a firing solution on the forward position, but left the rear 2 in dead ground. To engage all 3, she needed elevation and angle. She needed to be where they were not expecting her to be, which was directly above and behind the ridgeline, coming from the one direction they had not set up to receive fire from. Danny understood what she was doing before she explained it. That was what 6 months of flying together built. A shared spatial language, a shorthand of angles, and intentions that moved faster than words. He was already adjusting the weapon's system targeting parameters when she said, "I'm going high and over." He said, "Yep." She said, "Hydraulics hold for another 15 minutes minimum." He said, "Probably." She said, "Convoy needs the road clear." He said, "I know." Neither of them said what they were both measuring in the back of their minds. The math of what happened if the hydraulics degraded faster than projected at the altitude she was proposing. The math was not comforting. They set it aside together, the way partners do, and got back to work. The Apache climbed. Below, in the convoy, Captain Webb was listening to the radio traffic with the focused attention of a man who had learned that the difference between a good ground commander and a great one was the ability to trust his air support and stay out of their way. He had 23 people and vehicles that were currently parked in a valley with known hostile positions on the ridgelines, and the only thing standing between the convoy and a very bad morning was a damaged helicopter flown by a pilot he had worked with exactly twice before. He trusted her anyway. Some things you know about a person from 2 interactions. Some things you know from 30 seconds on the radio. His radio operator, a young specialist named Torres who had been in country for 6 weeks and had the particular wide-eyed alertness of someone who has recently learned that the world is much less theoretical than advertised, leaned over and said very quietly, "Sir, is she coming back around?" Webb looked at his radio, listened to the altitude readings coming through, watched the digital track of the Apache on his position display moving in a direction that made no conventional sense. "Yeah," he said. "She's going over the top." Torres processed this. Over the top of the ridgeline? Over the top of the ridgeline. Another pause. With a hydraulic warning? Webb said, "Specialist Torres, I want you to write down everything you're witnessing today, because you're going to want to remember it later." Torres did not write anything down. He just watched the screen. On the right ridgeline, the 3 insurgent positions had been silent for 90 seconds. This was their discipline showing trained patience, the understanding that after a failed first engagement, you wait, you watch, and you do not give away your position with unnecessary movement. They were professionals in the specific and unglamorous sense of people who have survived long enough to understand that survival is mostly about stillness. What they were listening for was the Apache's engine sound. The AH-64 has a distinctive acoustic signature, a particular rhythm of rotor wash and turbine noise that carries across valley terrain in a predictable way. You learn to locate a helicopter by sound the way you learn to locate thunder by counting. They were counting. The sound was wrong. It was not coming from where sound at altitude should come from. It was above them, behind them, on the wrong side of the ridgeline entirely, which meant the first Hellfire missile came from above and behind the forward position. The second came 4 seconds later, adjusted 200 meters north to the middle position. The targeting was not guesswork. It was not area fire. It was precise, deliberate, and informed by the thermal imaging that Danny had been running continuously, building a target picture through the entire engagement. The third position broke. They ran. Sarah let them run for 11 seconds, long enough for them to be clear of their prepared fighting position, in open ground, committed to a direction, and then she adjusted aim and made a decision that would appear in her after-action review as a demonstration of proportional force application and rules of engagement compliance. What it actually was, at the human level, was a pilot choosing to give people who had just tried to kill her a running chance. The decision took less than 2 seconds, and she never spoke about it afterward. She keyed the radio. Convoy lead, Apache 26. Right ridgeline is clear. I show 3 positions neutralized. 1 element moving northwest on foot, no longer oriented toward your route. You are clear to advance. I'll maintain overwatch until you're through the choke point. Webb's voice came back immediately. Apache 26, clear to advance. Outstanding work up there. How are you doing? And here's where the thing happened that people in that valley talked about for the rest of the deployment. The thing that got repeated at FOB briefings and shared over satellite phones and eventually made its way into the kind of informal military oral history that never gets written down, but never gets forgotten either. Sarah Valdez laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a relief laugh, not the slightly hysterical laugh of someone bleeding adrenaline. It was a short, genuine, quietly delighted sound. The laugh of someone who has just watched something impressively foolish fail impressively. And it went out live over the tactical radio network to every vehicle in the convoy, to the operations center monitoring the mission, and to a liaison officer at brigade headquarters who happened to be listening to the feed, and who would later say that it was the most competent sound he had ever heard in his life. She said after the laugh, "Danny, how are we looking?" Danny said, from behind his instruments, "Hydraulics are holding. I like to be on the ground in 12 minutes. She said, "We'll make 10. He said, "That's not more reassuring." She said, into the radio, still with the residue of that laugh in her voice, "Convoy lead, we're going to shepherd you through, and then we have a prior engagement with a landing pad. Keep your interval and stay under 100 meters per minute through the choke point. You've got 12 minutes of me before I turn into a pumpkin." Webb said, "Copy Apache 2-6. And, for the record, thank you." She did not respond to the thank you. She was already repositioning, already calculating the overwatch geometry for the choke point passage, already running the hydraulic numbers against the time remaining against the distance to the FOB. The convoy began to move. Torres, in the lead vehicle, watched the Apache track across his position display and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "She's still up there." Webb said, "Of course she is." The 13 vehicles moved through the choke point at steady interval, the valley road narrowing to its tightest point, the ridgelines rising on both sides in silence now. Clean silence, the kind that means the counting is done. Above them, Sarah Valdez flew a loose orbit with a hydraulic system that Danny was watching with the focused attention of a man who has learned that instruments do not lie, but they do occasionally give you optimistic interpretations of bad news. He updated his running estimate every 90 seconds. The numbers were holding. Not well, but adequately, which in the context of the morning felt like luxury. She did not speak on the radio during the convoy passage. She did not need to. Her presence was the communication. 23 people moved through ground that had been designed to kill them, and they moved through it in the shadow of something that had already met what was waiting and answered it. The last vehicle cleared the choke point at 0749. Danny said, "Last vehicle through." Sarah said, "I see it." Then she turned the Apache toward the FOB and flew at an altitude that was slightly lower than regulation and a speed that was slightly higher than recommended for a hydraulic anomaly of this type. And she did both of those things because she had done the math, and the math said that lower and faster got her to the ground before the system degraded past the point of easy management. She was right. She almost always was. They touched down at 0801. Hard but clean. The kind of landing that leaves no doubt about who was flying. The kind that is not graceful, but is completely controlled, which is a much more important distinction than most people who have never landed a damaged helicopter understand. The crew chief met them on the pad. He walked around the tail rotor assembly and looked at the hydraulic loss and looked at the route they had flown and looked at Sarah climbing down from the cockpit. And he said, with the particular expressiveness of a man who works on aircraft and therefore understands exactly what the numbers mean, "Holy," Sarah said, "she held together fine." He said, "Captain, she said, she held together fine." He looked at Danny. Danny looked at the horizon with the expression of a man who has decided that some conversations are above his pay grade. The crew chief walked back to the tail section. He ran his hand along the damage. He counted the hydraulic fluid trail that the Apache had apparently left across approximately 40 kilometers of Afghan valley terrain. He stood there for a moment doing the silent arithmetic that mechanics do when they're processing information that conflicts with their understanding of what is structurally possible. Then he picked up his clipboard and started writing. Inside the operations center, 40 meters away, a senior sergeant was already on the phone to the convoy operations officer, relaying the after-action report. He was reading from notes. His voice was flat and professional, the way operational voices are flat and professional, draining drama out of fact the way you drain water out of a sink. He got to the part about the hydraulic warning. He read it. He paused. He looked up at the screen where the track record of the Apache's flight path was still displayed. The climb over the ridgeline, the engagement pattern, the overwatch orbit, the recovery flight. He looked back at his notes. He said to the person on the other end of the phone, "Yeah?" She was aware of the hydraulic warning. Another pause. The whole time, on the flight line, Sarah was filling out her post-flight documentation. Danny was doing the same, 2 feet away, both of them writing in the particular shorthand of official military reporting that translates human experience into something legible to institutional systems. She got to the section for significant events and wrote, in neat, small letters, the factual sequence. Thermal anomaly identified. Engagement initiated by hostile element. Aircraft damage sustained. Hostile positions neutralized. Convoy safely escorted through route. RTB without incident. Without incident. Danny glanced over at her form. He read the last line. He said nothing. She capped her pen. The morning light was full and direct now, the amber gone, everything sharp and clear the way things get in that particular desert when the day has decided to be honest about what it is. Somewhere on a ridgeline 20 kilometers northwest, 3 men who had spent weeks building a perfect ambush were walking away from it, understanding something they had not understood when they arrived. And on the flight line, Sarah Valdez handed her form to the crew chief and went to find coffee, which she took black, which she had been taking black since she was 19, and her father told her that anything you add to coffee is just fear wearing a flavor. She drank it in the doorway of the operations building, looking at the sky. She was already thinking about the next flight. The debrief happened at 10:30. Standard procedure. 14 people in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and generator fuel, seated around a folding table with a topographic map spread across it, and a projector throwing pale light onto a screen that had a crack running diagonally across its lower left corner. The kind of room where the military takes the raw and violent and transforms it into information that can be filed, reviewed, and acted upon. The kind of room where the distance between what happened and what gets recorded is exactly the width of professional language. Sarah sat at the table and answered questions in the specific, factual way she always answered questions in debriefs, neither embellishing nor minimizing, just moving through the sequence with the orderly precision of someone who has internalized the understanding that clarity is more useful than drama in a room full of people who need to make decisions based on what you tell them. The battalion intelligence officer, a major named Chun who had been in this region for 11 months and had the particular sharpness of someone who had learned to find meaning in patterns that other people processed as noise, kept returning to the same point. The bait placement on the left ridgeline. The deliberate construction of a response behavior trap built around standard Apache tactics. The depth staggering of the right ridgeline positions. These were not improvised elements. Someone had studied. Someone had prepared. Someone had looked at the way attack helicopters respond to thermal anomalies and built an entire ambush architecture around that one behavioral prediction. He spread 3 reconnaissance photographs on the table and said the left ridgeline setup was in place for at least 5 days based on soil disturbance patterns. This was not reactive. Someone knew this route was going to be used. The room processed this quietly. Sarah looked at the photographs. She looked at the thermal imaging capture from Danny's FLIR feed, printed and placed next to the reconnaissance shots. She looked at the angles. She was not looking for comfort or for alarm. She was looking at the geometry, the way she always looked at things spatially, structurally, asking the shape of it to explain itself. She said the bait was too good. Chun looked at her. She said the left ridgeline signatures were visible at exactly the altitude and angle I was flying at. If they'd been 10 meters higher on the slope, or I'd been 50 feet lower, I might not have picked them up as cleanly. Whoever placed them understood the sensor parameters. Chun said, that's consistent with what we're seeing in other sectors. Adaptation to our equipment. Sarah said, they planned on the response being predictable. Brake left, descend, use terrain for cover, reposition to engage the apparent threat from the left. Standard doctrine response. She paused. The problem is that standard doctrine is standard because it works most of the time. Chin said, it didn't work today. She said, not because I did something brilliant, because I didn't like the angle I was on when I broke left. It felt wrong before I could articulate why it was wrong. She looked at the map. You can't train that out of people. You also can't guarantee it. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that falls when a professional says something true that nobody in the room has a useful response to. She made a note. The debrief continued. Captain Webb spoke for the first time. He had been sitting at the end of the table with his hands flat on the table surface in the posture of a man who has a lot of things he wants to say and has been in enough debriefs to know that most of them are better said privately. He said, I want on record that the air support response this morning was exceptional. The hold order came early enough that we had full stop before we entered the choke point. If we'd been 50 meters further into the narrowing when that first RPG fired, he stopped. Started again. The early call saved lives. That should be in the record. Sarah did not look at him when he said this. She was looking at the map, but something in the line of her shoulders changed, a small, almost imperceptible settling, the kind of physical adjustment a person makes when they receive something they do not know how to accept gracefully, and so they accept it quietly instead. The debrief ended at 11:45. People filed out. The folding chairs scraped. The projector was switched off, and the crack in the screen disappeared back into darkness. Chin stopped Sarah at the door. He said, quietly, with the directness of someone who has long since stopped bothering with conversational preamble, the hydraulic situation. You had a legitimate out, and you stayed on station. She said, the convoy needed overwatch through the choke point. He said, the convoy could have held until we put another bird up. She said, that would have taken 22 minutes. The hydraulics had 12. A pause. Math worked out. He looked at her. He said, that's one way to describe it. She said, it's the accurate way. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, the laugh on the radio. She blinked. It was the most uncertain she had looked in the entire morning. What about it? He said brigade comms officer called it in. Said it went out on the tactical net, and half the regiment heard it. He wanted to know if it was an equipment issue. A small pause. I told him it was not an equipment issue. Sarah said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, she said, was he asking me to not do that? Chun said, with the absolute flatness of a man who has made peace with the fact that some things in military life cannot be regulated, I don't think he had a category for it. She nodded. She left. The laugh had, in fact, traveled further than the tactical net. Communications being what communications are in deployed environments, porous, recursive, flowing through the informal channels with a speed that formal channels cannot match. The story had already moved beyond the forward operating base by the time the debrief ended. Not the full story. Not yet. The stories that travel fast are always compressed, always simplified to their most transmissible element. What traveled was this. Apache pilot gets ambushed, takes damage, neutralizes 3 positions, escorts convoy through, and laughs about on the radio. In the specific culture of combat aviation, where composure is the only currency that actually means anything, this landed with the weight of something that did not need explanation or embellishment. It was just passed along from person to person in the way that information passes when it carries the particular charge of being both true and representative of something larger than itself. Danny heard it secondhand before dinner. Someone had his version slightly wrong. They had the damage assessment inflated and the timeline compressed, and he corrected the factual errors with the focused irritation of a man who was personally present for the actual events and objects to having them made more dramatic than they were. He corrected the errors. He kept the laugh. He said, when the person telling it looked at him for confirmation, yeah, that part's right. She laughed. Sarah ate dinner at 17:30. Chicken, rice, the kind of institutional meal that tastes exactly like its category and nothing like food. She sat with Danny and two maintenance crew members and a logistics officer she had met once before, and the conversation was about a soccer match, a faulty generator in Building C, and whether the chow hall would ever get the coffee machine fixed. She did not talk about the morning. This was not avoidance. It was not suppression. It was just the way she processed things. She filed them. She moved forward. She let the debrief be the debrief and let dinner be dinner and kept the different compartments of the day organized, because that was how you stayed functional across the full length of a deployment that still had months left in it. What she thought about privately in the 40 minutes between dinner and lights out was the geometry, not the danger of it, not the near misses, the geometry, the shape of the thing that had been built in that valley, the patience of it, the structural intelligence of it, the way it had been designed around a prediction of behavior, and had failed because one pilot's instincts had deviated from the predicted pattern in one small, uninstructed, unteachable way. She thought about that gap between the plan and the outcome, how narrow it was and how significant, and how it would never be comfortable to know that the whole morning had balanced on the half second of an instinct she could not fully explain and would not always have. She thought about Webb and his 23 people, the 7 vehicles parked in a valley, the static weight, the radio. She thought about her father, 30 years ago, looking up at a sky that did not look dangerous and knowing anyway, in some wordless pre-articulate part of his understanding, that it was about to change. She touched the left breast pocket of her flight suit, her brother's photograph, pressed flat against the fabric. She had called him that evening, briefly, satellite connection crackling. He had asked how things were going. She had said, fine, busy. He had said, you always say that. She had said, it's always true. He had said, I know you, and she had heard the specific worry in his voice that she had been hearing since she was a teenager and had long since stopped trying to argue with, because you cannot argue someone out of loving you. She had said, I'll call next week. He had said, you'd better. She lay in her bunk in the dark and listened to the bass sounds, the generator hum, the distant helicopter rotors of a late mission departure, the particular ambient noise of a place where 200 people are trying to sleep in proximity to a lot of things that require staying awake. The hydraulic warning light lived behind her eyes when she closed them. Yellow. Insistent. The sound of the first RPG going past. The pressure change Danny had described. The FLIR image of 3 heat signatures arranged in a pattern that someone had spent weeks constructing. She thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to be the thing that someone else had studied, to be the behavior that had been mapped, predicted, planned around. There was something clarifying about that, something that stripped the abstraction out of the work and made it immediate and specific. You were known. You were legible. Your patterns had been read and turned into a trap. And then you had deviated from the pattern. By instinct, by accident, by the accumulated weight of 6 years of reading skies and angles and the shape of things before you could name what you were reading. She thought, the gap between prediction and outcome is the only space that matters. She fell asleep with that thought unfinished, the way she fell asleep with most things, not resolving them, just letting them settle into the background noise of a mind that was already moving toward tomorrow. In the morning, the crew chief had a preliminary damage report on her desk before she got there. The hydraulic system had been closer to failure threshold than Danny's running estimate had suggested. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, closer. The numbers were in the report, precise and unemotional. She read them. She set the report down. She picked up her coffee. She had been right that it would hold. It had held. The math had worked out. Whether that was judgment or fortune or some combination of the two that cannot be cleanly separated after the fact, she did not try to decide. She knew enough about both to understand that they are always tangled together in the same outcome, and that the debriefing, the reporting, the official record will always sort them into neater categories than reality produces. What the official record would show was this. Captain Sarah Valdez had responded to a complex, pre-planned ambush with tactically sound decisions, maintained aircraft control under fire with a significant hydraulic system anomaly, neutralized hostile positions threatening a ground convoy, and ensured the safe passage of 23 personnel through a designated enemy kill zone. What the official record would not show, what official records are structurally incapable of showing, was the half-second, the angle that felt wrong before it computed correctly, the instinct that preceded the understanding, or the laugh which had gone out over the tactical net and traveled through the informal channels and arrived in different versions at different tables and would eventually, in the way these things happen, become one of those stories that a generation of pilots in that unit would carry home with them. Not as a story about danger or courage in the way civilian people frame those words, but as a story about something more specific and more useful, about what composure actually sounds like when it is real. It does not sound like silence. It does not sound like the flat professional voice of controlled fear. It sounds sometimes like a short and genuine laugh from someone who has just watched something very elaborate fail, and who is already, before the sound has finished, before the radio has released the frequency, before the convoy has moved a single additional meter, already calculating what comes next. Sarah Valdez flew 3 more missions that week. She requested the same rotation, same route, same convoy lead. What but not ask why? He signed a request and handed it back to the liaison officer and said nothing, which was itself a form of answer. She flew the route clean every time. The valley below was the kind of beautiful that feels like a trap. She noticed it every morning, filed it away, set it aside, got back to work.